about. Then it's the birth of nationalism we'll get to. You will do an assignment about nationalism as well, but we'll get to that in, let's see, 2 weeks perhaps. It won't be a big assignment, so don't worry about that. We'll also address imperialism after a while, and then we'll try to focus at least 1 or 2 lessons on 19th century Sweden, what happened then. This was before Sweden became an industrialized country, and it was quite poor. People were basically cooking their own boots at home to have food. They were eating their shoes to survive. It's crazy. Okay, so the objective today, well, for the whole unit, will be to continue to develop your ability to investigate and discuss and describe historical processes, but also how to understand how history is used in society today. And what we mean by that, I'll get to that eventually, but not this lesson. And last lesson, we talked about the Industrial Revolution. This was yesterday, so I hope that I don't have to remind you that much about what we said. We talked about the prerequisites of the Industrial Revolution, why it happened, and especially why did it happen in Great Britain at the time when it did. And we also said that, like, the whole foundation, the basic idea, the core idea of the Industrial Revolution is the transition from muscular strength to mechanical energy. So you can produce goods and fabrics in a lot faster and more effective, efficient way. And this is sort of this is a prerequisites for the society we're living in today. And this is the transition between agrarian society and industrial society. And you can't really underestimate how big of an impact this has had on our society. It's the reason for why we have medicine the way we have today. It's the reason why we have the technological development we have today. The reason for why we can sit right now and having this lesson. It's the reason for why you can travel like we do, why our jobs is the way they are, what kind of jobs there exist. And it's the reason for why if you want to eat a toast today with some melted cheese on it, perhaps some mozzarella, you can do that. You can go to the store and buy it. You don't have to create it for yourself. And we can thank the Industrial Revolution for this toast later today. Now, however, we're going to focus on the life in the 19th century industrial society and not in the life that we have today in the industrial society. Because, of course, it was quite different back during the 19th century. Okay, so a few things we should mention. With industrial society, more people gained access to more and cheaper goods that we have already addressed. The new factories that we had, especially in Manchester, Liverpool, and such industry cities, they provided better clothing and coal in the industrial society. That made the winters warmer, and new goods such as tea and soap that they received from trade could become more and more common. So now people could clean themselves in a new way with better products to do that. They could choose between different varieties of tea if they wanted to at the market. And they could live in warmer households because they could have coal to warm themselves. Of course, that would before, but now they could warm big buildings in a new way. So in summary, industrialization contributes to increased and cheaper consumption. And today we're living in a society that is sort of centered around consumption. And this is thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Well, you don't necessarily have to say thanks to the Industrial Revolution. It's just an effect of it. And we also say industrialization improved the options of transportation. Huge sums were invested in railway constructions during the 19th century, and land railways started to connect urban areas with rural areas. I mean, we shouldn't really underestimate how, like, the small amount that people traveled before the Industrial Revolution. I mean, a lot of people who were living in, say, Småland or Dalarna, they didn't really visit Stockholm, perhaps once in their lifetime, if even so. And, you know, before the Industrial Revolution, during the 19th century, you had different time. The clock was put different in every city in in Sweden. So, like, if you were on if you were in Gothenburg, then the time would perhaps be 10:55, and if you were in Stockholm at the time, it would have been a different time. And the reason why people started to have, the same time zone in Sweden was because you started to connect the countries, and you needed a time schedule for the railways and such. So these sort of changes that happened during the Industrial Revolution, the rest of the society really had to adapt to it. So everything, almost every part of society had to change. Another example of this would be the idea of the family that we're familiar with today. Perhaps a mom and a dad, at least two parents, and then a couple of kids. Today would be like three or two would be the standard in Sweden. But before industrial society, when people living in farms, they were living in, the families were a lot bigger. You were living with your father and your mother. You were living with your grandparents. You were living with a lot of siblings and perhaps your uncle, and everyone was living at the same farm, contributing to the farms and the work they did there. But now when people were, as we said yesterday, moving to the cities and urbanization happened, that meant that people had to start to live in small apartments, and they couldn't fit big families in there. So now it was just perhaps two parents and a couple of kids. And eventually, when this family started to adopt into the new ways to live in the industrial society, this also led to the fact that the norms that we have today or at least that existed during the 20th century, with the man of the household working to earn money, and the female of the household would be at home being a housewife. This was pretty much, it started here with the Industrial Revolution, where it sort of got at least more clear that was the tradition that was supposed to happen, or that was supposed to go on. Another thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution was the school. During the 19th century, children started to go to school. The reason for why this happened, before, most kids, they worked, and they also, perhaps the only education they got was from the church. But now the state had a new interest, and it was to educate everyone. It was basically boys went to one school between the age of, it could be like 4 to 7 or 4 to 8, and that was it. And girls went to one school. But the reason for this was that the state wanted to educate citizens to be good future workers, to be good workers in the industrial society, so they could contribute to the industrial society and the nation's economy. This, of course, has to do with nations competing against each other. So it's important, if you want to be a rich nation, that you have good workers that could work for you in the factories, that could know standard facts, that perhaps could read the newspaper and so on. So it was necessary to have a good school. It was a necessity for a rich industrialized society. Another thing why they had school was also to teach children to obey their masters, basically. It was to obey the state, to don't rise up against the state, don't do a revolt if you're having bad working conditions. So they were really trying to make well-behaving, obeying citizens also in these schools. So take a look at the working conditions, because that is perhaps one of the things you usually talk about when you talk about the ways of life in industrial society. You might remember from Högstadiet that they were quite harsh, especially in England during the beginning of the 19th century, but also in Sweden up till, I would say like in the midst of the 20th century. And the working conditions are tough and harsh today, still in a lot of places in the world. But if we take a look at, let's say, England and during the 19th century, it was not uncommon to work 12 to 14 hours per day for very, very low wages. You could even work longer than that sometimes. You can imagine that was being tough. It was more common for women to work in the textile industry than it was for men. Men was preferably working in the mines, for instance, or in other factories that didn't revolve around textile industries or the creating of fabrics. And it was also common for children, sometimes 6 to 7 years old, to work in both mines and factories. The reason for this was Well, it was basically, why not? If there's children who don't have parents, and if they don't have anywhere to be, why shouldn't society use them as workers? And also, children are small, so they could fit into small places in the mines. So they didn't really value children, or at least see them or acknowledge their rights in the same way we do today. So it wasn't really, for a lot of people, it felt like this was a good solution in terms of trying to increase revenue in an industry. Why not have children working there? Of course, there were at the time also people who thought that this was outrageous. So the working conditions was tough in the industrialized society. We have it so much better today. I don't think I have to underline that. But this also led the way to a new type of hierarchy. Like in every unit that we had in this course so far, and every past society that we've discussed, we've always acknowledged that there is a hierarchy of some kind. Whether it was the patricians and plebeians in the Roman Empire, or if it was the feudal society in the medieval times. Now, with the French Revolution, the state division system, it disappeared, but you have a new type of hierarchy now, and it's the ones that we're living in still. It's the upper class, the middle class, and the working class. So in terms of economic classes, it's not, some would even say that this is a meritocracy, which means that it's not which class you're born into that determines how it's going to go into your life. That what determines is how good you are as a citizen, how well you can behave, how good merits you have at your workplace, and so on. Now, after a while, the working class began to unite in order to criticize these unfair conditions. Because I said it was harsh working conditions, and we have to remember that most people at this time were workers. This was the majority. And after a while, they started to protest. They started to say, we can't work during these harsh conditions. So they started to unite, and they did like what Per did. They raised their fist to the sky and rallied together to to sort of make the rest of the society acknowledge their rights as workers, rights that we have today, but they did not have back then. And we have this man who is one of the most important and interesting thinkers that we have in Western history, who talks a lot about this. And I'm sure someone can unmute themselves and tell me who this is.
Karl Marx.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's Karl Marx. He's perhaps as I said, one of the most interesting philosophers, or he was a sociologist and historian, and also one of the most misinterpreted and criticized thinkers as well. So it's always interesting to discuss him. He was not just talking about politics, he was talking about basically all parts of society and the way humans behave. But we're going to focus on his political opinions about the industrial society. And this is what you're going to discuss as well in smaller groups. So it's very important that everyone listens now. He was a German philosopher who advocated a communist society in which resources were distributed fairly among the people. He didn't really just advocate this. He thought that this was inevitable. It will happen eventually because of the philosophy behind his worldview, something that we're not going to go into in a deeper level now. That's more a philosophy subject rather than a history one. But we know what we have to understand here is that he criticized both capitalism and the industrial society for many things, but one of them would be the unfair exploitation of workers. The industrial society puts people, according to Marx, in the position as workers, as proletarians, and that has huge consequences of the minds of human people, but also on the way we behave and the way we feel and the way society will work in the future. The task will be now for you to read one of the most famous scriptures that he has written together with his friend Engels. It's the Communist Manifesto. You're just going to read a small extract from it, and it's published on Google Classroom in the stream. Now, I published 2 documents there. There's one document with the extract of the Communist Manifesto, But then you also have a document with assigned groups. You're all assigned one specific group, and every group has one Google Meet link. So join that Google Meet link and choose one of the members in your group to be a secretary to write down your answers, your discussions. And you can also find some questions there that you're supposed to discuss regarding the extract about the Communist Manifesto. And you will do that, and I might pop in to see how everything's going. And then we're going to meet again at 11:35. So you have almost 30 minutes to do this. Does that sound clear? On the industrial society during the 19th century, and it was that socialist ideas and unions started to emerge. They had visions and ideas of how to improve the situations for workers in the industrial society. This would also be the foundation of the labor movement in Sweden, who has definitely been one of the most significant events in Swedish history and why our society looks the way it does today. So we have the unions. I'm sure you know what union is now, but since you've studied civics for a while, but it's a group of people that works with sort of trying to, well, they're the voice for workers' rights in society. They try to make sure that everything goes correctly according to law, and they fight for the rights of workers. So for instance, if I would break my arm, both my legs tomorrow, let's hope that that does not happen, but imagine if I do, then it's going to be very difficult for me to teach you guys in the lesson. And for Ms. Heimeyer, she might think that no, it's going to be really difficult for Mrs. Sundström to teach those kids without two working legs. So I should perhaps provide a wheelchair for him, but that's expensive, so I just fire him. She could think like that, but she can't do that in today's society because I'm protected by rights and laws that we got thanks to the unions. However, it did happen during the 19th century. If you broke your arm, if you were working in the mine, then you probably would get fired. If you got sick and stayed home for 10 or 7 days, you probably would get fired because there's no reason to have you working. If there's no reason to pay you if you're just at home and being sick. So your right as a worker was not protected until we had the labor movements and the unions started to work for this. The results were different in a lot of countries. In some countries, unions fought for minimum wages. In Sweden, we fought for an agreement between the agreement between the workers and the employees. So when we talk about 19th century socialism, you don't have to write all this down, but we should make this distinction between reformists and revolutionaries. Sometimes we too drastically talk about socialists during the 19th century and think about the revolutionists. The revolutionists were the ones who wanted to provoke a violent revolution in order for communism to happen. Workers were dissatisfied with their terms, so they wanted to provoke violence in order to get a revolution. However, reformists were the ones who wanted to gradually change society by implementing political and peaceful improvements for the worker. This is basically what happened in Sweden at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. This is a photograph of the labor movement in Sweden during the 19th century. I think this is from the northern part of Sweden, from a day of protests. And of course, you now know this is now the direct effect that this had on society today. This is the reason why we're all having a day off, the 1st of May, so that workers should at least have one day every year when they're free, that is not a weekend, where they could go out and employees should let their voice be heard, so to speak. So this is what happened. This is why people demonstrated. Today it's not just socialist parties who do this on 1st of May. I think we're going to stop there, actually. I don't think we don't have to take this any further today. But the objective was for you to gain a little bit of understanding of the socialist critique that especially Karl Marx, but also the labor movement had on the tough working conditions in the industrialized society.